I'd like to demystify Italian cast-on. Italian cast-on is very similar to Judy's Magic cast-on. Both cast-ons will give you 2 rows of interconnected knitting. Judy's Magic will give you the 2 rows but on 2 needles so that knitting is going in 2 different directions. Italian cast-on will put all the live stitches on 1 needle, so it is a tubular sort of cast-on. You can work Italian cast-on in 2 colors or 1. For 1 color, you merely fold the yarn in half and have a skein end and a tail end as you would for long tail cast-on. In this example, though, I am doing it in 2 colors because I think it's easier to learn it in 2 colors. I have tied a loose overhand knot to hold my 2 colors together. In a project, you would get cast on and work a few rows or rounds, then come back and unpick this knot and weave in your tails. So don't make the knot too tight because you want to get rid of it later. The setup for my hands and my yarn is very similar to slingshot long tail cast on. This yarn at the back is my knit yarn and the yarn at the front is the purl yarn, and you may be saying, what do you mean knit yarn and purl yarn? Well, you see how the needle is in the middle. When you make knit stitches, yarn to the back and knit, and when you make purl stitches, yarn to the front and purl. So knit yarn and purl yarn. Also, Italian cast-on is done in pairs that are knit, purl, or purl, knit. I'm going to work knit, purl because I think that's more common. So I want to start by knitting up with this light colored yarn. Well, if I fold this dark yarn on my thumb, this purl yarn, in half, can you see how that upside down U looks a lot like a stitch? I can sort of imagine that's a stitch, and I want to knit through that stitch. So right needle through the stitch, and then wrap the yarn as I would for any knit stitch, and bring the needle and the yarn forward, and there's a knit stitch. If you are a continental knitter and used to having the yarn in your left hand, that maneuver was probably fairly familiar. If you are an English knitter and used to having yarn in your right hand, that may have seemed a little strange. I'm going to do the same thing, pretty much, except I'm doing it purl-wise. So I imagine this light yarn on my index finger as if it were a stitch again, but now I want to purl, which means right needle tip goes back to front up through the stitch to purl it. Wrap the purl yarn, and then take the yarn and the needle to the back as if I do for any other purl stitch. So that was a knit and a purl. I will do that again. So needle ducking under front to back and knitting up a stitch, and then needle ducking back to front and purling up a stitch. So it's knit and purl and knit and purl. And you can see that once you get the hang of it and a little bit of rocking motion to it, you can be fairly quick with it. Okay, so when you are ready to start your first row, you want to hang on here and flip the work. And the reason for hanging on is I need to keep this twist right here. You can see that when I bring that dark yarn up to work the first stitch, that will lock in my light yarn, and then I won't lose any stitches. So that's Italian cast-on. If you work it in 2 colors, that works really well for double knitting. In 1 color, it is beautiful on 1x1 ribbing, and this can also be used in brioche knitting. So I hope that helps you remember Italian cast-on is merely knitting and purling, very similar to what you already know how to do.